Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, in almost all cases and in almost all organizations, for-profit and not, government and private, it is the chief executive that sets the tone as the spokesperson that represents the culture of the group to the world, and rightly so. But if you really want to see what's going on behind the scenes and get a grasp clinically on a company or the organization, then talk to the person that is responsible for balancing its books, for writing its checks, for auditing revenue against expense. It is the CFO or the Chief Financial Officer in many cases that directly is responsible for the risk an organization takes on. On this CBR, the CFOs, if you will, of North and South Carolina, we will ask the Honorable Janet Cowell and the Honorable Curtis Loftis how they see these many contemporary policy issues that challenge our region. In a moment, the Carolinas keepers of the public purse.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded July 19th, 2013. On this week's program, Janet Cowell, State Treasurer of North Carolina, and Curtis Loftis Jr., State Treasurer of South Carolina. Now, Chris William.
Welcome to our program. Happy summer, and good to have you both here, Your Honors. Thank you for joining us. This is kind of unique. We've never had you two together.
We like each other. This is fun to be another treasurer.
Another treasurer.
Yeah.
You have someone that understands what you both go through.
That's right.
You know, which is interesting, what you both go through. Here, we hear so many, Treasurer Cowell, we hear so many debates about policy, about balancing budgets, about revenue sources, about what's right, and especially in North Carolina. And Mr. Loftis, we're going to give you a chance to wade in here because South Carolina is not too far behind tax reform in North Carolina. But when we talk about tax reform, how do we, in your head, in your office, with your teams, I've got to think that revenue is pretty much an uncertainty these days. So how do you model beyond that? How do you look out even 5 years?
Well, as you know, the North Carolina General Assembly is in the midst of their tax reform debate, so it isn't totally clear. I think probably the question is going to be how much of a revenue cut are we going to get? Anywhere up to, $3.3 billion was the latest proposal from the state Senate, and somewhere in the $1 to $2 billion from the House. So that seems to be the two bookends, and the question is, where are we going to fall in the middle? And then the question, of course, is do they want to engage in more debt? I think it's still a pretty debt-averse crowd as well. So I think it's pretty clear that North Carolina is going to have more constrained revenues going forward. The question is just how much.
Let me stay with you for a second here, Madam Treasurer. So when North Carolina is debating this real, and I think it's fair to say this is at minimum a secular or a change in the DNA of how North Carolina raises revenue from year to year. Does a chill go down your spine to think, we're stepping into something really new here. We need to go slowly. We need to have more debate. What goes on in your head?
Well, I've been a huge advocate for tax modernization because we do have an outmoded tax structure. We've got a jalopy. We need a Honda Civic. We need something modern. But that they have to balance that with stability. And obviously just having the debate can create some instability. With fairness. So if we do cut those revenue streams, where do they fall? What services get cut? Who benefits? So those are the questions in my mind as I watch this. And will we have enough resources for a growing state when it comes to infrastructure, schools. How do we compete if we have lower revenues?
You were a member of the General Assembly, so you understand how the sausages are made. Do you feel like they have utilized the Treasurer's office for some of the modeling and some of the planning that needs to be done?
We had a lot of conversations early on. I'll give credit to Senator Rucho here from Charlotte. He really did engage with the office. And we have weighed in some. I'd say more recently, there's been less conversation and it has really shifted to the Governor and General Assembly. We have been, trying to give them the room to have those debates. And unless I see them really going outside the guardrails in terms of impacting a bond rating, just allowing that debate to happen.
Yeah, Mr. Treasurer, in South Carolina, there's been looks like the State House has ratified what this budget looks like, and part of this budget, as you well know, is $100 billion. Is $500 million for for transportation going forward. You're going to leverage $50 million into about $500 million. How do you look at that? With some of the same questions that we asked Madam Cowell here, how do you think about modeling revenue in a state like South Carolina when a lot of the revenue is in flux?
North Carolina is a much wealthier state than South Carolina. We don't have the highs and lows. We're very steady. We have good years and bad years. So we miss out on some of those good years, but like this year, we have plenty of money, as they like to say. We counseled against that bond bill. We thought that the infrastructure ought to have specialized revenue streams. It shouldn't come from the general fund. General Assembly thought otherwise, and they've done it. We were drowning in infrastructure problems like all states. So this sounds like a lot of money. It's not that much money, and we're going to have to come back next year. As far as tax reform, we're not doing a lot there. There was a little not very serious attempt last year. We're going to an election year. It's 10 and a half months now from the primary. So I don't think any hard work's going to get done between now and then.
So when you watch tax reform in the Tar Heel state, do you think any of that will have like a contagion effect in South Carolina politics when it comes to tax reform?
I hope so. We elected a lot of new folks. Like I was new. The governor's new. When we start our second terms, I think you'll see some freedom. The governor can only have 2 terms. I can have as many as the folks will have me. But I think she'll really start looking at it. And she likes she's an accountant by trade, so she understands a lot of these issues. I think she'd like to have a good fighting chance at it. Election year is just not the time.
What do you think, CFOs, I think that's fairly accurate to say, but when you look at your states, when you look at what goes on, and not just public debt and not just revenue, but you got to be thinking about risk a whole lot. What do you think are the pieces of risk that are not being talked about as much? What keeps you up at night?
Well, and of course, we have one of the largest pension funds in the country. It's over $80 billion. And you think about the enormity of that pot of money and the impact it can have on the stability of your economics, the state. And so interest rate risk, North Carolina has always been.
And explain what that is, Madam.
Yeah,
because
so we have a large amount of money in bonds in North Carolina. And in the past, that was a good thing. That has served our state well. We are one of the best funded pension plans in the country. But I was talking to Hugh McCall yesterday. I had the good fortune of just talking to him. And I said, I don't think folks realize when you have 35% in bonds and interest rates are rising. Over the past 2 months, we've had an investment bill sitting in the House. They haven't acted on it. We have lost over $1 billion in fixed income in that time period. Now, we couldn't have averted all of those losses because it takes time to move, but I'm trying to convince folks that risk, what used to be a low-risk investment is now an extremely high-risk investment, and it's bearing down on us like a freight train, and we really need the flexibility to move this money, put it in something that's less risky and has a higher return so that retirement security, I can keep retirement security.
So $1 billion off of an $80 billion pension fund, it's certainly a meaningful amount. Is that, some people will say, yeah, but it's interest rate risk and a lot of that's already weeded out. Do you think there's a lot more to come on that risk?
That's the tip of the iceberg, because we all know interest rates have nowhere to go but up. And that was the May, June, and maybe interest rates will flatline for a little while, and we won't see aggressive upward movement. I doubt we'll see a lot of aggressive upward movement. But when you have 35% of your portfolio in bonds, and it takes time to move billions of dollars, we need the ability to plan and get some of that money out of bonds.
How does this compare and contrast to what's going on in South Carolina's pension system?
Risk is the number one problem in every state in the union. The problem with risk is it doesn't show up on your balance sheet. You know, you don't have an expense line. Then you have, this is your risk, you know, realized and unrealized. There's so many different types. You've got the interest rate problem now with bonds. But when you move to alternatives, you have a different set of problems. If you're, you know, heavy in equities now, you have a different set of problems. And as I move further and further into this, being my first term, risk is one of those unexplainable, unquantified problems that we have. And then you can go from plan to plan, see different ways how it's managed. You know, we try to hedge our risk. We have a significant alternative allocation, far greater than y'all's. I mean,
what percentage?
Well, we're well over 40%.
That's hedged?
Yes, there's alternative investments, and we're actually
about
higher.
24%.
Yeah, and we're actually higher than that. What's happening now is the states that are way out on the edge, we started just redefining things. You know, things that were alternatives yesterday are traditionals now.
Right.
So it's a little bit of game, which I think is a mistake. I like alternative investments. I don't have a problem with them whatsoever, and I like the progressive nature of them. But you got to realize they are different. You know, it's like owning a Ferrari and owning a Chevrolet. Chevrolet is going to crank every time you go to the garage. The Ferrari's got to take some love and care. It's a different due diligence, both initial and ongoing. Different reporting, different mechanism to manage them. So while they're very helpful, there's a lot of risk there. We trail the S&P and our peers every single year. Now, their retort is, well, we're going to lose less money in the downturn. Well, this year, had we just made the average return of our peers, we would have made an extra $450 million. We're leaving that on the table this year. Last year was about $150 million on the table.
And what's the shortfall in South Carolina?
$15.2 billion. $15.2 billion in a small state like South Carolina. And this is one of those areas where they throw the debt out there and the average person doesn't know the debt's there.
Janet, you were on CNBC recently, and you said that you'd really like to change the allocation formula to allow you to be more flexible and to maybe avert some of the fixed income risk that you talked about. Aren't you worried at all, though, if you try to take more risk with alternative investments or hedging it somehow, that you're going to end up adding more risk to the portfolio and you're reaching for return, and you still have the same issue that maybe it's not interest rate risk, but it's another risk that you haven't quantified?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, every individual investor out there is grappling with the same thing. When the risk-free rate is, you know, less than 1%, how do you make a return without taking on too much risk? I think for us, we see some good growth prospects that have lower risk than bonds and stocks in things like real estate, you know, distressed real estate, credit. We do direct lending where banks can't lend in Europe, you know, we can lend in Europe, and that is high growth but fairly low risk. So I think North Carolina, we have been conservative. There's no way we're going to go way out on the risk curve, but we are saying you look at the current interest rates, the math does not work to have 35% of your investments making less than 1% and try to make 7.25%. We can lower that return. You know, maybe it should be in the 6%, but as Curtis and I know, then you're asking taxpayers to fund a lot more of these systems. And so far, we have tried not to put that burden on the General Assembly on top of what has been, you know, some pretty rough economic times.
So then where is the turning point where you do turn to the State House or the General Assembly in Raleigh and you say, you know, we can only make up so much of this, and I know you don't want to hear this because you got so many other priorities, but you have to make up the shortfall for these pensioners as well as for the other people in North and South Carolina.
And we're saying, give us a fighting chance by giving us some options and flexibility. You're right, there's no silver bullet. There's no easy way to make 7.25% when the risk-free rate's 1/4. But at least if you give us flexibility, we have a fighting chance to get close to that. And over time, we think the economy will recover and we'll get higher growth rates. But and my simple definition of risk for viewers is just not having enough money to retire. And that's for the individual or for a pension, not having enough money to pay the bills at some point way down the road. That's my definition of risk. And I would say right now, bonds aren't going to get us there.
How about going to the State House and saying, you've got to help us on closing this funding gap. We can't do it all by reaching for more return because it's going to mean more risk.
Well, the big mistake was made years and years ago when almost every state separated, not just physically but emotionally or intellectually, the pension plans from the rest of the budget. Because we compete with dollars. I mean, road dollars, school dollars, healthcare dollars, all those dollars, they're all thrown in, except they're kind of hidden and thrown away here. They come in from employers that we call them employers, but they're school districts and police departments. It's tax dollars. And it's all that tax dollars gets thrown into the mill, but we separate some out. We think it's special, but it's not really special. Now, we do have special obligations, but at the end of the day, all those dollars are in competition. So now that we've done that, we're stuck with these two pies. And I think at some point, especially after quantitative easing is over, when the interest rates do make the flip, I think we're all going to be in real trouble. We've had this equities bubble, and no matter what we're doing, I think we're all going to be running the State House at some point.
Let's talk about a couple of other big dynamics. You talk about quantitative easing that the Fed is doing, but we've also, the news cycle was hot on sequestration after the first of the year and how it was going to blow up, and really it's starting now to show up in the system. So we've got, metaphorically, we've got the antelope going through the python, and we're trying to get it through there. So how are you planning for sequestration cuts? How are you planning for a possible another round of BRAC, the base realignment and closing? How do you factor all of that in?
Obviously, in North Carolina with Fort Bragg and a lot of the other military installations, I think we have felt it in pockets around the state already. And then to your point, I think there's more coming in the education space. I know in North Carolina, we'll probably see tens of millions of impact on budgets, as well as thousands of positions in early childhood work-study programs. Mm-hmm. So folks will be, as they go back to school, I think they will notice some of that. But in terms of, I think it's all going to get blended as we cut revenues in North Carolina. Probably some of those budgetary impacts, it's going to be confusing to the person on the street as to, is this federal, is this state? All they're going to notice is, Johnny doesn't get their work-study program anymore.
Right, right. Same thing.
Same thing. And South Carolina has a heavy reliance. We're one of the probably 5 states that rely on federal government the most. And it's going to be difficult. But
do you have any modeling, though, out there, Curtis?
Some,
we know Savannah Riverside's not going to get this money, or Columbia at Fort Jackson's not going to get this money. How does that work?
Yeah, we looked at all that, but then you also look at the same time that the new healthcare laws are all coming in. And then you think about that at the same time that maybe QE3 stops. And you get into all these things, and you model yourself to death. We're fortunate that we are a conservative state. We don't have a lot of money, so we're careful. We don't have a lot of luxuries. So we think we'll be okay, but we'll wait and see.
So October 1st, the Affordable Care Act, many provisions go into play. There's still many provisions that haven't even been fleshed out yet. So not to re-ask this question, but how do you model how the Affordable Care, how Obamacare is going to impact employers, state employees? How do you go through that model?
Well, and that's, as we know, last week they delayed the implementation. Right. So to your point, it's very difficult to I was a financial analyst and I made financial models as my first job out of college, but you can't really model this stuff. It's just that the rules aren't established enough to put it on paper. So I think I run the state health plan, so we have built in the coverage for young adults up to 26. We're looking at which drugs need to be given, without a copay. So some pretty minor things so far. I think the bigger impacts in North Carolina are going to be that you have to give temporary or some contract employees health coverage. And we are working right now, I think we're glad we got the delay because, trying to figure out how many folks, the legal definitions, and what the impacts will be. I think for some departments, it's definitely millions and millions of dollars in having to provide health insurance for folks that, were previously they were able to not provide.
Would you tell the governor of North Carolina to rethink the idea of taking federal dollars for health care?
Well, certainly, and I know South Carolina didn't take the Medicaid expansion either. There are real fiscal impacts of that, and obviously Medicaid has, I think, Governor McCrory has pointed to Medicaid every time we've had to make cuts in other programs and said that is taking money. We did turn down a lot of federal dollars. So certainly we're going to be feeling the impacts as we pass this budget of making that decision, but obviously there's politics and other decisions that go into that. So it's a tough job being governor.
Oh, tough job being treasurer.
It is.
But it is one of those things that I am glad I'm not the governor right now. We'll let Nikki worry about that.
Right now, does that mean, is that code for something?
No, that was a poor choice of words. I think there are lots of things. We're finance folks, so we're talking about finance. But there's more than that. There's the shifts that are coming from Washington in governance. And the economy itself. We're changing as a nation, and it's just not picked up in the numbers. I'm personally involved in hiring a very important job at the office, and I'm looking at the resumes. They are completely a different set of people that you would expect to have.
Is that bad or good?
It's just different. And I think that the bean counters are not looking at how many wives or husbands of doctors and lawyers are stopping working, and they're never going to work again. They used to have great jobs. They're, the stereotypical doctor and their wife is a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a teacher. Those people are just getting out of the workforce. We see it all the time. And if you have a part-time job that requires some degree, you would believe those people who want a part-time job. It's just the culture is changing. We're not going to be as rich in the future. I don't blame this on the present administration or the last administration. The world is changing. We had our hopes on globalization. We had our hopes that Brazil and the pigs and the BRICS and all those guys will come along and be just fantastic. And these things just aren't really panning out. Are they? They aren't. We're changing as a culture. We're having more college kids aspire to go home, and they're remodeling the downstairs of their parents' houses, and they're going to live there when they get married. Kind of a pre-1900s or a European type of thing. Culture is changing. Our country is changing. And the quicker we realize that and realize that it's not being captured in the financial reports, the better off we'll be.
Dare I say that sounds like a stump speech to me?
Well, it's not.
Just a little.
I haven't made it yet.
In the last few minutes, we've been talking, and it's easy to look at the statistical evidence, as you both do, and not go to the dark side to say, gosh, this has changed, gosh, this is going to be a challenge. But, Madam Secretary, let me start with you. What are you most encouraged about?
Well, we talked about a lot of the challenges of budgets, but there's clearly so many ways that you can invest in technology. Both Treasurer Loftis and I met with SAS in Raleigh, the technology company, and there's just so many ways you can modernize government to do the services for less money. I think there are still very bright people wanting to go into public service who've got private sector experience, public service. So I'm hopeful there are ways to be pragmatic, solve these problems. It is increasingly challenging, though, with the amount of politics. I think at the federal government level, the partisan gridlock is really bad. I think at the state level, it's still more pragmatic, more workable than at the feds.
Yeah. Washington, we all have our friends in Washington who go to work there every day and try to do the best they can, but I'm hopelessly lost. I don't have the slightest clue what's going to come out of Washington next.
Well, then is there a good model? Again, here we use this model. Is there a good balance between just good policy and nonpartisanship? Is somebody doing that right? Do you see examples of that?
I think you see it in Treasurer's office. I think you see it in a lot of what they call down ballot offices, because lots of times it's just a math problem. We solve math problems, or we solve other types of just logistical problems. I come from the business world, and we run the Treasurer's office like it's a real business. And I don't have someone looking over my shoulder saying, well, is that equitable or fair to everybody involved? We just don't deal with those issues. But I do, to echo a little bit what Janet said, it is appalling what goes on in government, even at the state level, that shouldn't. Government is decades behind business in the way it manages its affairs. And lots of times I underestimate how serious the situation is, because I say, surely it can't be that bad. Surely they closed the books. Surely, I assumed that we had audits in state government. Most of the audits are agreed upon procedures, and other people get audited once every 5 years. There had not been an audit in the Treasurer's office since 1988.
I almost don't know where to go with
that.
Yeah,
and so, but you see these things. You'll hear people talk about audits, but you say, well, what was audited? The office or a fund? When I get into government and you start asking questions, well, the first thing it does, it gets you in a lot of trouble, because people don't want to answer the question honestly. But when you ask questions about how government really works, and when you follow money, it is surprising. And we've got to, at least in South Carolina, got to do a much better job at that.
We have about 30 seconds left. You get the last word.
Well, let me just give one great story. Waste Zero, it's a company up in Raleigh. They've added 60 jobs. They work with governments to adopt reduction of waste, saves the government money. They're hiring people. And I think they've had trouble in North Carolina adopting the model, even though they're based here in the state. But there are win-wins out there, and there are smart people, there's money to be made, there's jobs to be created. And I still get excited when I get to talk to people like that.
Are you encouraged that those kind of examples will end up bubbling up to the top?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's a great way to end. Thank you. Not only that, but thank you for the job that you do, because it can be thankless, as you well know, but it's good to have you both here together, and I hope you'll do it again. Hope you'll come back.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Treasurers need more love.
Thank you. You need more love? Sounds like a bumper sticker or a ball cap.
I heart treasurers.
Thank you. Till next week, I'm Chris William. You heard it here first. Good night. Have a good weekend.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.